currently and will most likely be for the rest of my sorry life, in prison for a crime I did not commit. I won't go too much into the details, but basically there was a murder and it got pinned on me. Wrong place, wrong time. Now I'm here, stuck in purgatory. At least that's what it feels like. Been here for a couple months now, and I finally managed to get hold of a phone from one of the guys in here. You can get pretty much anything you want in here, for a price of course. Seems as I was a Redditor before being dumped in here, I thought I'd start a digital prison diary or some such thing. I thought it would hopefully keep me sane, and some people might want to read it, just like you are now. People love hearing about prison, and I'm rotting away in here, so I may as well tell you all about the prison life. Well, that was my intention, up until my new cellmate arrived. Now everything's changed. He's a strange guy, not met anyone else in here like him. He's quiet most of the time, kinda disheveled, long greasy hair, scratchy beard, and thin as a twig. Strangely, he also has a vague similarity to myself, if I've been left out in the woods for a couple years or something. Anyway, he came in on his first day and didn't say a word. Just sat on his bunk, staring into the ceiling, and would wander around aimlessly whenever we were let out. He was like this for a few weeks. I didn't even know his name or what he came in for, and I just left him alone. He could have been crazy for all I know. There's a lot of crazy folk in here. I've seen multiple people get their heads caved in for no reason, and I don't want nothing like that happening to me, so I just mind my way. He didn't give off that sort of vibe though. He was creepy for sure, and if you were in a certain radius of him, you'd start to feel cold and unsettled, as if some kind of dark aura was surrounding him and was now seeping its way into you. I got used to that after a few days. I guess I had to. Everyone left him alone too for that reason. Even the crazies and prison gangs didn't want to go near him. Even they sensed a darkness to him. After a while, I started to notice that sometimes he'd stare at a particular cell on the floor above. It was empty and had been since I arrived. No idea why. Maybe something bad happened in there. I'm not sure. No one seems to know, and the guards don't say shit about it either. But he'd just stare at it like it meant something. I'd look at it too, but there was nothing there. Then, just the other day, he finally spoke to me. It was late. Everyone was practically asleep already, and I was drifting in and out of sleep when he suddenly said, "Have you ever noticed that guy in cell 12? Why does he never come out?" I didn't register what he'd said at first. I couldn't really remember the cell numbers. "What cell is that?" I asked. "The one in the far corner, the only one that never opens." I realized what he was talking about now. He was talking about that damn cell he was always staring at. That must be why he keeps looking at it. He thinks someone's in there. This guy was more disturbed than I first thought. I stayed quiet, thinking of something to say to him. I don't think there is anyone in that cell. Been empty since I came in, and everyone knows about it. Ain't a soul there. He took a while to reply. "There is. I'll show you." I laughed and eventually went to sleep. The next day I sat down at my usual spot for lunch, not remembering the strange conversation I'd had the night before. When he came over to me, he leaned over me, his hair tickling the back of my neck. Then he spoke. "Let me show you. He's there now." The memory of our conversation faded back into my mind again. It felt like a half-forgotten dream. "Oh yeah, you told me about him last night. I can't see anyone from here." I had looked over at the cell and couldn't see anyone. "You can't see him from here. Come with me." He turned and walked towards his usual spot. I sat in place watching him, unsure whether I should go over to him or not. I didn't want to indulge in his delusions, but there's not much else to do around here, so I thought it would be a brief moment of entertainment. I walked over to him. No one else was around him as always. He stood up right as I reached him and said, "Here, sit down." He wanted me to sit specifically in his seat, so I did. Look, there he is. I followed his gaze, and then his hand as he pointed up to the cell. My focus switched from his pointed finger to the cell, and I couldn't quite believe what I saw. It was a man, his face pressed up against the bars, looking straight at me with eyes stretched as wide as they could go. No light came from the cell, and none of the lights outside penetrated it enough for you to see anything within it. So his face looked like it was attached to nothing, like a floating head. An intense sense of dread washed over me like a rogue wave. It completely knocked me out. Literally. I remember nothing after that and awoke in a prison hospital bed with an unbearable headache. The nurse said I passed out and then hit my head on the floor. A nasty concussion, but nothing more. I'd never passed out before, and I had no reason to either. Maybe he did something to me. My thoughts were confused, and the headache was overwhelming me, so I tried to stop thinking and just rest. I went back to my cell after another night in the hospital, only to find that my cellmate was gone. His bed was pristine, and the smell that lingered in every room he entered was gone. I asked the guard what happened to him, and he looked at me with a confused and slightly annoyed look on his face. He didn't know who I was talking about and said I'd never had a cellmate. I thought he was joking, but he didn't laugh with me when I began to chuckle. I started to ask around, and no one knew who I was talking about. I felt like I was going insane. Has the entire prison decided to join in on a practical joke against me? Did I dream the entire thing? I have so many thoughts going on inside my head right now, and typing this out is certainly helping. He was definitely real. I know he was. I have to go back to that cell or sit in his seat tomorrow so I can see that man again. Something strange is going on here, and I need to find out what it is. I'm a hazmat cleaner in a very specific niche. Basically, I clean hoarder houses as well as family homes after traumatic deaths. It's a necessary job. First, imagine the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. Like being a parent whose teenager just shot herself, or the survivor of a murder-suicide. Then imagine going home after the reports are filed and the detectives are done, and having to scrub your loved one's dried brains off the walls. That's where I come in. It's surprisingly easy to acclimate to corpses and gore. Depending on the situation, bloodstains can be hard to deal with, only because they're always in context. The spatter on the children's SpongeBob quilt, the smears across the cheerfully rustic kitchen, the violent spray over family portraits. The stark evidence of violence over the normal trappings of a family home can be disturbing, but even that gets easier over time. The hardest part is the smell. Sweet and almost gooey, with undertones of vomit and fetid swamp, sweat and unwashed skin. The stench strengthens and weakens seemingly on a whim. Sometimes I swear it moves, drifting across a room or directly overhead, or lunging forward to swallow me. But the rest really doesn't bug me anymore. Even mattresses dripping with decomposition juice get unremarkable after a while. Now, a couple days ago, I was assigned to a suicide house. The victim was a middle-aged lady with hoarding issues. She lived alone. Her much older brother lived in a nursing home. She called him like clockwork once a week. Suddenly, she stopped calling. 4 weeks passed and he was frantic. He has dementia and other issues. His sister was his only family, the only one other than the parish priest who ever came to visit, so he felt her absence keenly. By the time his caretakers finally called in a welfare check, his sister had been dead for at least 3 weeks. It was pretty ghastly, as advanced decomposition tends to be. The one good thing I can say is, at least it's been a cold spring out here. Low temperatures alleviate the stench somewhat. The house is a neat, narrow little 2-story with a slightly overgrown yard and a tiny grove of apple trees out back. Nothing out of the ordinary. Inside was another story. It's hard to describe bad hoarder situations. Entire rooms are overwhelmed with literal mountains of trash. Clothes and stuffed animals, books and papers, cheap gas station figurines, cat litter, dead animals, old electronics. The list is endless, and somehow it all looks the same. Just a morass of garbage and forgotten belongings steadily claiming the house from its human occupant. This lady was no different. Treacherous slopes made from old newspapers and books filled every corner. Christmas trees, stuffed animals, dishes, garbage, pillows, and so much more filled out the rest. Claustrophobic, filthy, and foul-smelling. As cleaners, we typically just throw everything away. The filth and biohazard issues make donation impossible. If we find something valuable, jewelry, antiques, and so on, we set it aside for the estate. For the most part, though, these belongings are worth less than the trash bags we put them in. Again, this lady was no different. It took 2 days to clear a path to the back of the house, and 3 days to actually empty out the rooms. It took a full day to clear the stairs, which, for some reason, were literally coated with dried vegetation and what looked like a metric ton of table salt. According to real estate information, which we always dredge up before entering a home, the second level had 2 bedrooms and an office. This is where things suddenly got weird. The bedrooms were immaculately clean, which was impossible. The entire stairwell had been packed floor to ceiling with garbage. There was no way this lady would have been able to clean up here. Even if she'd been climbing through a window every day, the entire situation defied hoarder behavior. Ignoring a sudden case of the creeps, I inspected each bedroom. While thoroughly permeated with the stench of the lady's recently removed corpse, they were utterly spotless. The paint on the walls even glistened. The office was more like it, stuffed from floor to ceiling with dead plants, specimen cases, and paintings. About a dozen taxidermy animals sat in a neat row facing the wall. It wasn't as filthy as the downstairs by any means, but it was much more in line with my expectations. Due to the smell, most of the stuff, cool as it was, couldn't be salvaged. There's just no reliable way to get 3 weeks of steadily worsening corpse stench out of household belongings. Even so, I took a good look at most of it. I'm an amateur zoologist. Thought I was going to be Steve Irwin when I grew up. Majored in biology and everything. So this is where it all gets awfully strange. First, the specimen cases. These are the small glass displays, usually around 12 by 12, that people use to pin dead bugs and blossoms. You know, like butterflies and beetles. Now these things were definitely bugs, but they weren't normal. For example, one was a coppery caterpillar with a flat, almost humanoid face. Pinkish skin, wrinkles, eyelids sinking down into empty sockets and everything. Another was this arachnid thing with a bluish crab-like body and a single desiccated eye peering up from the thorax. Yet another looked underdeveloped, almost fetal. It had wrinkled sage-colored flesh and long ears that reminded me of a basset hound. At this point, I was pretty sure I'd stumbled on some eccentric lady's collection of gag gifts. The taxidermy animals made the joke theory a lot harder to believe. The first one I saw was this tiny, slow-eyed thing with beautiful features, corrupted by unnatural proportions. The second was basically a giant, lacquered anemone with what must have been 1,000 rot-rimmed holes boring through the tentacles. The worst looked like a person with a frozen, open-mouthed smile that spread to its ears and 5 glassy eyes arching over the upper lip. By this point, I felt paranoid, even frightened. This wasn't right. None of this was right. A typical hoarder house on the first floor blocked off from a pristine, empty second floor. And what were these things? Sophisticated fakes? Somebody's forgotten art installation? But how did these things get up here? And how were they all so clean? Because I was no longer sure if these items qualified as garbage, I carefully sorted and stacked everything. Then I got started on the walls. Paintings cluttered every inch, literally fitting together like puzzle pieces. Most were more or less unremarkable, if cool-looking. Lots of surreal landscapes and stylized creatures, which are catnip to my fantasy-loving self. But one painting in particular trapped my attention and wouldn't let it go. About 7 feet tall and maybe 3 feet wide, it dominated the room. Rendered in 100 shades of green and black and gray, it depicted a misty, primeval forest drenched in moonlight. Luminescent flowers sprouted along upraised tangles of tree roots. A tall, forbidding figure peered through the trees, half cloaked in soft darkness. No features, but the suggestion of strength was clear in its broad shoulders and long, sinewy limbs. A curtain of hair reflected the moonlight. I couldn't discern the color. The shadows were too deep, the lines and hues of the figure too indistinct to even begin to guess. After a few minutes, I realized all the hair on my arms was standing on end. With a huge, cathartic shudder, I spun around and pretended to survey the room. Or rather, pretended I wasn't afraid. As I stood there trying to mentally reset, a draft swept the room. Wet, cool, almost inviting, and, after the endless odor of human rot, beautifully sweet. Trying to remember when I'd opened the window, I turned. For a long, mesmerizing minute, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. That enormous painting had come to life. Tendrils of strange leaves swayed in that chilly, fresh wind. The glowing flowers bobbed, flattening slightly against the roots as the wind buffeted them. Somewhere deep in that unearthly landscape, a high, atonal song sounded. Wordless and open-throated, I imagined it echoing off icy peaks and down below in low, swampy valleys. It made me think of forests and mountains, wild rivers and endless plains. The only thing I couldn't picture was the creature singing the song. The figure stood silently. Only its hair moved, rippling in the wind like a banner. Then it took a long, sure-footed step forward. Moonlight glanced off its face, illuminating an impossible sharp cheekbone and a dark, cavernous eye. I bolted. I tripped down the stairs, falling flat on my face at the landing, then scrabbled up and ran out of the house. I don't even think I locked the door. I know I shouldn't go back. I don't know what that thing in the painting is. Honestly, I'm not even convinced it's real. But the thing is, I want to go back. Not because I'm fearless, far, far from it, but because I want to know more.